evolution in changing DNA that could take us on actually either of those paths very quickly?
Yes, very, very good question. Yes, so it's true that we now have the technology to go in and make edits to our own DNA or to the DNA of any organism in a precise and deliberate way. So in principle, that gives us the ability to make changes to the DNA of embryos that can then go on to be humans and basically be passed on from one generation to the next. So in principle, that gives us the ability to direct our own evolution, which I think is kind of what you're getting at. Yeah. So that's actually, I mean, it's something that I think is going to be possible if it's not possible already. Whether or not people choose to use that type of technology on humans is a question that a lot of people are interested in and discussing now. If we do go that route, what will it mean for our future evolution? I think essentially there's so many different ways that could affect our evolution moving forward that it's almost impossible to say anything about it. But I do think that it could lead us into a situation where we could alter the course of our evolution from what would happen sort of if we kind of continue with what is happening now, which is sort of largely what I've been talking about. There's concern about who would have access to such technology. Some people, everybody, what would it be used for? People have been talking about designer babies for a long time, and basically the technology to make some of those changes, again, is coming on board. But an important point to take into consideration is that although we have all this information about the human genome, we know the sequence, and we're starting to learn a lot about how an individual gene affects particular traits, there's still a lot we don't know. And so I would argue that we are not yet close to being able to know if you made a particular change to a DNA sequence, what all of the different implications would be of making that change. Genes interact with one another in complicated ways that we're working on unraveling, but it's something that I think we'd have to be very, very cautious about any changes that we made, especially on a large scale. Yes?
Do you think, though, that would ever be a large enough swath of the population that would have access to that technology to actually make a difference? Because it can't just be pockets, to make a whole species.
Yeah, it's a great point. So, how many people would have to be doing this in order for it to make an impact? Yeah. Right. And I think it's a similar question for something like in vitro fertilization. What is the impact of something like that on our entire species? I think you're absolutely right that for it to have a sizable impact on our species, it has to be something that is affecting a very large percentage of the entire population. Certainly that's not the case so far for in vitro fertilization or other assisted reproductive technologies. For something like gene editing, it would also have to be affecting. Yeah, and birth control. Right. On the rise, but not yet affecting, certainly not accessible to everybody. Yeah, good question. Yes?
Do you think there's a concern with biological computing, people trying to upload their consciousness or what makes us human into computers that would affect evolution that is feasible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So what about sort of the fusion of man and technology? And how might that affect our evolution? A couple of thoughts about that. One is that it would have to be something that is heritable. So for it to be an evolutionary change, it would have to be something that's passed on from one generation to the next. So if this is a type of technology that is not just a modification of a person and then their kids don't have that modification, if there's some sort of modification that was heritable somehow, then it would have the potential. And I'm not sure how that would work, although what you might imagine is something that we become essentially very dependent on, right? So if we start outsourcing certain aspects of our biology to technology, that could lead us down a route where the ability to do that thing naturally starts to decline. So an example of people have thought about this with glasses. Glasses are a technology that has been around for quite some time, but because it affects our ability to see in a way that makes it essentially less problematic to have poor vision, that essentially could make us more dependent on that technology, moving forward. And so some people have argued that a similar thing could happen with other types of technologies like the one you're describing.
More my concern was, do you think that would halt evolution?
So I think the only way that evolution could ever be halted is if every single individual has the same chances of survival and the exact same reproductive output. Now, everybody has the same number of children. Anytime that's not the case, if there's some heritable difference in the number of kids that people have, there will be some type of evolution happening. So it's really quite difficult for evolution to not happen. It's essentially inevitable in any kind of population, I think, including humans. So as long as there are a lot of us, and as long as we vary in ways that are heritable, including the number of kids that we have, then I think evolution will continue to happen. Yes?
Is the increase in longevity a result of evolution, or is it just because of better conditions to make people live longer? And if it is a result of evolution, how does that correspond with the baby making?
Right. Yeah, good question. So the question was, does we see an increase in average lifespans today? And the question is that a consequence of evolution? I think there's a couple of things going on there. I think part of it is we have better healthcare and technology for improving lives into older and older ages. But another aspect of it is actually what's happening with babies, right? So part of what you see is the average lifespan is going up, in part because fewer children are dying at younger ages. So that's a sort of a statistical artifact. But I definitely think it's true that people are living well into older and older ages. I don't think it's an evolutionary consequence, and the reason for that is that most of those changes are happening beyond the age at which most people are having kids. And in a way, evolution sort of can't affect that, right? Evolution sort of only can affect traits that relate to survival up until childbearing age or reproduction during childbearing age. Yes?
With the DNA technology that we have today, could we possibly at one point in our lives have a mad scientist or Hitler scenario to where they make species or human, the superior race and that type of thing?
To like engineer a different type of human? Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question. So there are people working on creating synthetic organisms, like making life from scratch, but nothing so far, anything as complicated as a human. So the goals right now are to create like a bacterium, single-celled organism from scratch. Could we eventually get to the point where we'd have enough technology to create an entire human? Possibly. Again, I think it would, there are, with a lot of these things, like with gene editing, it gets into a lot of ethical questions of whether we should do it. I think that's why you said, could a mad scientist, somebody sort of on the fringes who's not conforming to ethical standards, what the consequences would be, even if that would happen, it sort of goes back to the question of how widespread is it, right? So if you have a single person that is, engineered and built from scratch, the impact might be minimal on us as a species. If it starts to be something common, that would be a whole other scenario. But I think we're pretty far away from that now to know to sort of think about what the implications would be. But if we start making multicellular organisms, then we'll have to come back to that probably. Yeah. Yes.
One more question. Yeah, go ahead.
I know we have very few limited, very isolated populations. So like, the one that comes to mind is like the pygmy population, things of this sort that are extremely isolated. And out of curiosity, have we seen a lot of evolution changes in those isolated populations? I mean, I know we have limited time frame of
Right.
recorded history, but are we seeing it from generation to generation? I mean,
Yeah, it's a good question. So what do we see in populations that have been historically isolated? You're right, there have been a number. The Andaman Islanders in the Indian Ocean are sort of an example of.
I know it's limited.
a population that's been isolated. I think maybe arguably the most isolated population for the longest period of time was Native Americans, who migrated across the Bering Land Bridge and were isolated from the rest of the world for 8,000 years or so. And so clearly they didn't evolve into a new species, we know that, right? Do we see some changes? A lot of what we see is actually, it's not so much that they have accumulated differences, but a lot of it seems to be the consequence of having expanded into a new area, probably initiated by a small group of people that then, if they were successful, expanded. And then some small group of them went off a little bit further and they expanded. So you have what population geneticists call a serial bottleneck. You have a small number of individuals that then expands, and then a small number that expands. And each time that happens, you get a drastic reduction in genetic diversity. And whatever the individuals are that survive, whatever traits they happen to have become common in the next generation. So what you see is a reduction in genetic diversity the further you get from Africa. And that seems to make sense with what we understand happened in terms of our species expanding out of Africa, but going through these serial bottlenecks. And so in Native Americans, which are sort of overland about the furthest that you can get from Africa, you have the greatest reduction in genetic diversity. But it seems to be more of a consequence of them arriving there than changes that accumulated. Some changes probably accumulated while they were in isolation, but not really enough for it to be anything like speciation. Yeah.